Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Education and Culture Committee. Today is Wednesday, February 26th. I'm the chair, Councilmember Jawando, and I'm joined by my colleague, Councilmember Albernaz, and Councilmember Mink is on her way. We have two items today. One's a supplemental appropriation, 2540 for the from the MCPS fund balance for the purposes of special education. We'll get into that in a moment. And the other is a session, a briefing on what MCPS is doing around interventions for highly impacted students, our students with disabilities, our students, low-income students, farm students, and our students who speak English as a second language. I just want to start by saying on both of these items, they're obviously interrelated, and we'll get into the fund balance transfer, but I think it underscores how important the where we are right now in kind of an emergency of special education, and how we needed to transfer these funds mid-year, and how the costs and the needs of those students continue to grow. Obviously, as we head into budget, we're going to talk more about today. A big part of the budget proposal is to hire more special education educators, both paras and full-time, and which underscores again how great the need is. I'm really disheartened that last night the House of Representatives passed a budget bill that would gut a lot of the programs that support the students we're going to talk about today. I just can't imagine that. Unfortunately, here we are talking about how we best support these special populations when the budget bill that was passed out of the House will cut support for SNAP and for highly impacted students and families. And so, we have to understand the context that we're in, and that this is the things we're going to talk about today. Even as we head into budget, these aren't nice to haves. These are things that we have to do effectively to support our most vulnerable students, and that all of this is interconnected. So I just really appreciate the work that's being done, and we'll get into the topics, but I wanted to say that at the beginning. We have 1,700 support staff that are eligible for retirement. I don't have to tell you how much of a disaster that would be if we lost a significant portion of those folks. So there's a lot to talk about, and we have to be effective in how we spend our money, given the context at the federal level and at the state level, and locally. So a lot to discuss. I'm looking forward to getting into the conversation. So, Mr. Prouty, maybe I'll turn it to you. Let's start with the appropriation.
Thank you very much, Council Vice President Jawando and Council Members Albernaz and Mink. I'm Doug Prouty, Senior Legislative Analyst. We're joined for this item by Alfonso Windsor, the Chief Financial Officer of MCPS. This supplemental was introduced at the council meeting at the council meeting on January 14th, and a public hearing was held on January 28th. The allocation of $17 million is going to be used to fund current special education salaries and a variety of services for special education students. The details of the funding for the supplemental are found on a chart on page 2 of the packet, and details also in the transmittal memo, which is on pages 3 and 4. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Alfonso Winter, good to see you. Any background? Obviously, I gave a little background. I mean, this is not while this is going to be pretty pro forma, we're going to go through this, and I suspect it'll pass through us in full council. I do want to just mark that why we're having to do this, and to have you give a little context about that.
Sure. So thank you. So as we all know, special education, there's a lot of needs in special education. So we've been talking about it since last year. When we looked at the budget this year and we started examining the needs, we realized that the hiring efforts that were done, obviously, to support special education, the employees were hired, new employees that higher than we anticipated, which resulted, in an issue in terms of our salary, salary lapse for our budget. And then We've talked about it. Special education, has talked about the critical, staffing needs for students, the one-on-one paraeducators, contractual services for special education. When we're not able to fill positions, obviously contractual services have to take place. So all of that resulted in, when we started looking at our finances, this year, we knew that we needed more funding. So we used $10 million from our current fund balance and $7 million that originally we were targeting for an employee benefit plan that I know we've discussed, at this committee before as well. But the special education needs more urgent, so because we know that we have to support the students. So that's why we are requesting the $17 million supplemental to make sure that we're able to provide, those supports and those needs.
Really appreciate that, and obviously that's to meet current needs, not to expand service in any way, which obviously we'll get into in the next conversation and going into budget. What is the current? What would the fund balance be after this transfer?
So our current, when we're submitting our financial reports month by month, we are assuming that we're going to get the $17 million supplemental. So right now, in our last financial report from the board, we are still projecting a $2 million deficit. That's assuming that we get the $17 million supplemental. We are making progress month by month. We instituted a spending restrictions in MCPS. We are really hopeful that this month things are going to look a little bit better. But yes, the current financial monthly report reflects assuming that the $17 million appropriation would be approved.
Right. So $2 million in the negative with the appropriation, $19 million without. Okay. And we're joined by Laura Stewart, speaking of the board, so thank you, board member. Thank you for being here. Any questions from either of you? Okay. So without objection, we will move this to full council, and thank you for explaining why we're doing it.
Thank you for your support.
All right, Mr. Pratty, let's get to the big topic.
Thank you. The item number 2 for today is work session on interventions for highly impacted groups. The Board of Education heard updates on literacy performance for special education, emerging multilingual learners, and students who are participating or have participated in the free and reduced meals program on October 10th and October 22nd of 2024, respectively. The panel is here today to provide more current information on the demographics of students in these subgroups, trends in enrollment for these subgroups, data on academic performance, descriptions of support programs and services, and professional development for MCPS staff to support students in these subgroups. The panel is joined by Sally Murick, who is a the paraeducator program manager for MCPS and also vice president of the MCPS Paraeducators Chapter of SEIU Local 500. She will speak after the MCPS presentation. And finally, I want to thank the MCPS team here today and the staff in central office who helped them prepare their presentation. Council staff appreciates their collaboration, timely delivery of data and materials, and your work on behalf of our students. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. Peggy Pugh, Chief Academic Officer for Montgomery County Public Schools. And if you would go to the next slide, we're happy to be able to share with you today the variety of academic support services that we have, how they're designed, what they are for all students, because it really doesn't cross the different groups based on our philosophy that all students need access to good first instruction, first, guaranteed, and then these supports are layered in. Some of the supports that you'll hear about today are intended to be designed so that in that first instruction, students can participate. The specially designed supports that we'll talk about today are in 2 categories: the big bucket of special education services and what that looks like, who's participating and what we have, and then English language development services for students who need assistance in language acquisition. We also are going to embed throughout the strategies that we're using and leaning heavily on for reducing these persistent outcome disparities that have existed for years that we need to close. And then finally, it's important, I think, to understand the various levels of accountability that we have as a system, federally, for the state, and then here locally as well. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Diana Wiles.
Good morning, Council. I'm Diana Wiles. I'm the Associate Superintendent for Montgomery County Public Schools Office of Special Education. And we can go to the next slide. We wanted to start with showing you what our trend data looks like. The enrollment overall in Montgomery County Public Schools has gone down over time. However, our enrollment of students with receiving special education services and our identification of students who require these services has continued to go up. So within an 8-year period, we've grown by 3%, which seems like a small number, but it's a significant number of students that we're identifying every year that are moving into the district and require these services, and that are coming through our infants and toddlers programs, pre-K and into school age, that we are identifying who require some significant supports and services.
So that looks, just to put a number on that, just so we're clear, 3% in a big system. On this chart, if I'm reading it right, that's about 4,000 students
That we've added
since 2017.
Correct.
In special education.
Correct. Next slide. Our most recent data as of this month shows that we have 24,403 students who are identified with special education services. This slide shows you the racial breakdown of our student groups, but it also, and I want to highlight based on what you said, Chair Jawando, our Medicaid eligible students, and this is very significant for the work that we do. What we're able to do for students who are Medicaid eligible receiving special education services, we bill for and are reimbursed from the state for some of that funding. So it goes to helping us to pay for staff, pay for services, pay for instructional materials for our students. So I certainly was paying attention to what happened on the federal level last night, because that may have an impact on our budgetary needs moving forward. The last line in this slide shows you our dually identified student group, our emergent multilingual learners who are also receiving special education services, and that accounts for about 27% of our total number.
Just before you move on, the Medicaid eligible point, so 9,600 students, how much money are we getting back roughly for that right now?
Approximately $5 million.
Okay.
That's really dependent on whether or not we actually bill for that reimbursement. So some of the challenges we may have is if we can't fill vacancies, we can't bill, because it has to be a certificated person who is providing the services who is also billing for the services. But we bill for academic services, we bill for related services as speech and language, OT, PT. And so if we don't have a person, then we can't bill. So it's generally we underbill for those reasons where we have vacancies.
Thank you.
But it is a significant portion of money in our budget. Next slide. Specially designed instruction is at the heart of what we do for students receiving special education services. It is what is the distinction between what we do for general education students and what we are required to do by law for students receiving special education services. It's how we adapt the content, the methodology, and the delivery of instruction. It happens in general education classes. It happens in self-contained special education classes. It happens in art, in physical education, and it may even happen in recess and lunch. So it is what do the providers do to allow students receiving services to gain access to their general education setting, to gain access and developing social skills with their peers. Next slide.
Sorry. Yep. That's it.
Thank you. And so this slide shows you how we target our students with disabilities, and the concentric circle diagram really shows you how we narrow down the focus of the support services and interventions that we provide to special education students. Universal design for learning, our outermost circle, is what we do to accommodate all students. How do we bring in cultural responsiveness? How do we change things so that we're pulling in all of the needs of all of our students? Differentiated instruction is what do we need to do a little bit more differently if students may have some instructional needs that are not at the level of special education, but students enter school with different needs, enter school with different experiences, and so how are we changing the environment, changing how we teach? That would be differentiated instruction. Where we started to narrow the focus is our multi-tiered systems and systems of support. This is, you've probably seen at other sessions, the 3 tiers, where we start off with good instruction for all students to the 3rd tier that requires very focused interventions, strategies for students who may be requiring some significant supports in the classroom. Especially designed instruction, as I said, is at the heart of what we do for special education students. It is what special educators are taught to do in school. It's how they support general educators in co-teaching classes. It is what general educators do to support their special education students in their inclusion classrooms. Next slide. This is really just to emphasize the lack of professional learning for general educators who are primary service providers for most of our students. Higher education does not prepare general educators to teach students in their classrooms who have special education needs. About 72% of students with disabilities are inside general education for the majority of the school day. But general education teachers typically only receive about 1.5 courses during their teacher training programs. That's approximately 3 semester hours. And one of the challenges that we have in the school system is that even with professional learning opportunities, where do you find the time? Where do you find the substitutes to cover, to pull general educators together to provide them the professional learning that they need? As we always talk about, we have a shortage of special education teachers, so we really have to rely on building the capacity of our general educators to support students in their classrooms because students are in their classrooms.
Just before you leave this slide, it just underscores, we're going to hear from Ms. Muirk late in a minute, the importance of the paraeducators in those classrooms when you have this kind of stark, you have 30 kids in a class and 10 of, you're going to have 5 to 10 with an IEP. It's impossible for that general ed teacher, especially without the paras. Go ahead, Ms. Pugh.
And I would just add to it, thinking about it, when this data were shared with us from MSDE, the conversation was about, with the amount of hours that a teacher has in getting specific professional learning about how to do this, within the first week of school, they have been expected to deliver specially designed instruction for more hours than they received training in. And so it is a gap, and it is a gap for our paraprofessionals and for our teachers, both in the pre-preparation and then in the responsiveness, because student needs are so unique. They're as different as you and I are, and we have to know that, learn that, use the data on that, and then strategically plan that specially designed instruction. So it's time-consuming, and it's a shared responsibility.
Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit later about the interventions, the specific interventions that are offered in MCPS that are used both with students with IEPs and other student groups. But one of the things we wanted to highlight is all of the ways that we measure performance and that we modify what we're doing for all of our special education students, both globally and individually in the district. The first bullet is one that most people don't know, but we have a report card. Special education has a report card that they receive annually from the Maryland State Department of Education. It measures certain federal indicators and what our success is on those indicators. There's a benchmark that we are supposed to meet each year, and it measures everything from timeliness in terms of our procedures, for initial evaluations, to whether or not we are placing enough students in inclusive settings. It also measures disproportionality for suspensions, So it is quite a few indicators that are measured annually. And with that, if we're not meeting that benchmark, we have to develop corrective action plans. Oftentimes that requires us to do additional professional learning. We may target, using our data, schools that we see may need additional support in meeting those benchmarks. We also use our quarterly IEP progress reports for our students to measure where they are 4 times a year in addition to their report cards. All of our schools were instructed to ensure that in their school improvement plans that they are considering the needs of our students with disabilities and how they are using their data to inform what on a school level they need to either modify or enhance to ensure that students with disabilities needs are being met. And then we use our system-wide data, classroom performance, state assessments, district assessments. We measure where our students are and look at what we may need to do to enhance both the skill sets of our general and special educators as well as the specific supports that we have in place for individual students. And then finally, every student has an annual IEP review where we gather and analyze data on a student level to determine whether or not students are making progress, what support they need for the coming year, what services they'll continue to need, and whether or not they are being successful or if we need to make any changes to their program, as well as doing 3-year reevaluations to determine whether they continue to need services or if they have successfully met all their goals and are able to exit into the general education setting. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Hewlett.
Good morning, council members. My name is Tamara Hewlett. I am the director of the Department of English Learners and Multilingual Education in Montgomery County Public Schools. I am happy to be here today to talk about some of our best and brightest students in our district and who are a nuanced group of students that I know.
Intro music.
I know. This group of students is a very nuanced group of students that we serve, and we are making every effort to serve in the right way. Some of the themes shared by Ms. Wiles are common also for our emergent multilingual learners. So starting with our enrollment, if you could take a look at what is being displayed, you will see that over the past few years, we have grown our student population by about 1,000 each year, increasing. As of December 31st, we had 32,587 emergent multilingual learners enrolled in our district. That is just who is currently being served. That's not the ones who were recently exited. That's not the ones who were ever EMLs. That's just currently in program. Next slide, please. Here's a view that we see of our students by proficiency level. And so we serve our students based on their English language proficiency levels. What that really means is the more English you have, the higher your proficiency level should be, as demonstrated when you take the assessments. We have about 17,000 students who are at the beginning stages of their English language development journey. What that means is we are asking students to learn content and language at the same time, and they can do it with the appropriate supports in place, and we have to recognize that they're at the beginning stages of their language development. If I were to be picked up and placed in Lithuania today, I come with a lot of knowledge, but I don't go with the language. We have students who come to us with a lot of knowledge in their home language, but without the language. And as content instruction continues to move forward, without the appropriate language development supports, gaps start to widen. And so it's very important that we understand that students are on a trajectory. The vast majority of our students are at the beginning stages. We have our level 3 students who, at the point of level 3, you have enough social language, and you're really learning the nuances of English to be able to be successful academically. And then we have our level 4 students who are really at a 4.0 to a 4.4, because in the state of Maryland, we exit students out of program at a 4.5 proficiency level, as measured by the WIDA Access for ELS assessment.
Could you just explain this chart? You know, you said the 17,000 number. I'm assuming that's elementary school, middle school, high school.
Yes.
Just explain what we're seeing here.
Sure. So when we look at this chart, we have our students by proficiency level, by school level, going across. We have our elementary school students where they are. So we consider the beginning stages of language proficiency to be levels 1 and 2. So when we look at elementary, we have about 10,000 students that are level 1 and 2. So when we talked about the 17,000, we are looking down in the columns of our total 1 and 2s to come up with that number. As I continue throughout the presentation, you'll hear more about our students, but it is important to note that in the past, like pre-pandemic, the students we saw coming to us from the international office, they were primarily elementary aged. Our elementary age students is stable in terms of hovering between 17 and 18,000 every year. What we've seen is an explosion in our middle and high school leveled aged students. And so when you think about language development, the younger you are, the faster it is to attain a language. These are things that if you are exposed to a language, and by the nature of the structure of elementary school, you see and you learn and you're immersed in the language, and you grow faster in your language development. When we have students coming to us middle and high school, it takes a little longer for them to grow in their language, and then the structure of school, it's not as an immersed environment as it is in elementary. So we are seeing over the years that more of our students who are coming to us who are joining our program are middle and high school aged by thousands, and our elementary schools are kind of stabilizing. Next slide, please. So to give you a clearer picture, just taking last year into account, the population we serve is an ever-shifting population. So the work that our teachers have to do is a massive undertaking, and they're doing it, but they also need supports to be able to do it successfully. So when we think about our students, our 32,000 students from last year, we had about 6,772 brand new to program. What that looked like was about 3,000 of them came through the international office. That's not all the total students who came through the international office, but about 70 to 80% of students who enroll through our international and admissions office end up qualifying for English language development services. So last year, 3,000, a little over 3,000 of them qualified for services and were in program for the first time. Then we had our kindergarten students. That's by nature of just, it's time to start school. 3,053 students entered our school system and qualified for English language development services in kindergarten. Also important to note that the majority of our students that we serve are U.S.-born students. I want to make sure that that is clear, that in our program, most of our students are U.S.-born. And then we had transfers into our school system. So that's whether they're transferring from another state or transferring from another Maryland county. That's about how many we have. But then we think about the students who were in program, who were making progress, who left us. And so we had about 6,000 leave. So we took in about 6,000 and we had about 6,000 exit. And you think about, that's about 12,000 of the 32,000 we served, and we still have that many. So it's a moving target, the work that we do, but we successfully exited close to 3,000 students out of program. And so what that means is when they took the assessment that they have to take, they scored the 4.5. They demonstrated enough English proficiency to exit the ELD program. We still monitor those students for 2 years. Again, they're not included in our total count, so we really are serving students who are, really are serving more than 32,000, but they exited. And that is a great success for those students. And then we had about 2,000 become inactive. That means they either transferred out to another Maryland county or to another state. And then we had our graduates for grade 12, 1,091, who, by the nature of them graduating, they exited the program.
Just go back for 1 second. So transfer out means they went to a different school district, or what's in that category?
So transfer
What's
out.
the most of that category?
Most of the category is they transferred out to another Maryland school system or another school system out of state. Okay. We do have dropouts who they just become inactive. There are some dropouts in there. I don't know the number. That's something we can
Would love to
look
see
into.
the breakdown of that.
Yes, but that's what transfer out means. Once
Grade 12 is they're going to graduate.
grade 12 they graduate. Yes, yes. Next slide, please. So when we think about all of this context, we have to think about how we're providing services to our students. And so Maryland is part of the WIDA consortium. WIDA stands for nothing, so it's not an acronym. It's just WIDA, okay? It used to stand for like 2 different things, but now it's just WIDA, okay? So the WIDA consortium, we're a part of it. And in that consortium, there's a framework that we use for instruction. Now, our English language development teachers are receiving intensive training on this framework. However, we know that our students are in our classrooms beyond the English language development environment. So we need to ensure that our classroom teachers also have this knowledge. And so the WIDA framework is anchored in 4 big ideas: equity of opportunity and access, and collaboration among stakeholders. And when our department thinks about the 4 big ideas, we kind of chunk them. So equity of opportunity and access and collaboration, to us, those are more the practices that need to be in place, the structures that need to be in place, and the mindset that needs to be in place to ensure that all of our emergent multilingual learners are being served. What we are trying to do is get a little heavier on the instructional approaches, which are the integration of content and language and the functional approach to language development. And so our department has been working across content areas to try to train not only our English language development teachers, but our content teachers as well. Just like Ms. Wiles said, in terms of special education and teacher prep programs, the knowledge gained in our teacher prep programs nowadays, it only goes but so far. And as I described our very nuanced population, we as a school system, we have to invest in training our teachers to meet the needs of the students we are serving. And so that's the work that our department is trying to focus on. It is an undertaking, but it is where we are putting our efforts. Next slide, please. And so to understand how a student grows in their language proficiency, this is the framework that the Maryland State uses. Really, the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, is anchored in a framework, and so Maryland has adopted this framework that explains how a student is expected to grow in their proficiency. So let's just say, for example, a student on their very first assessment, which again is called the WIDA Access for ELS assessment, on their very first assessment, they scored a 1.2 overall proficiency level. You would look at the 1.0 to 1.9 row, and that student is set for their entire time in the language development program to that row. So a student who scored a 1.2 is expected to be in program for 6 years before they exit. 6 years is a lot of time, depending on when a student starts. So if a student started in 4th grade, that means the student is expected to grow in their language and content, across all 3 levels of their schooling career: elementary, middle, and high school. This is a lot of academic language. The assessment requires students to know the academic language of the content. The demands are heavy for our emerging multilingual learners. So every student is kind of set on their path, based on their first assessment. So again, the work that teachers have to do is nuanced, because you can't just say we're going to apply this strategy in a blanket way to all the students. We have to understand how to diagnose, understand where a student is in their language proficiency, understand what they need to help them grow, and then move forward for the various students who are at various proficiency levels in one classroom. Next slide, please. And so here's just some data. We can focus on the 2024 set of data. As measured by that framework for growth, we saw that our elementary students, about 66.7% of them met their target. So they went in the path, they achieved the next path wherever their level was. So 66.7% of our students, our elementary students, met their target. But then we see a sharp decline in our middle and high schools. Only 20.5% of our middle schoolers and 27.1% of our high schoolers met their target. So as a system, we have to interrupt this pattern to ensure that our middle and high schoolers are getting the experiences and the language development that they need to meet those targets. Again, for a student who is coming in for the first time at that level, the demands to learn content, learn language at the same time is heavy, and it is no excuse that our students are not meeting their targets. So we are taking intentional steps to focus. It's not that we're not going to pay attention to our elementary schools. We are paying attention to our elementary schools, but we have to be intentional about the supports we provide to our middle and high school teachers and students.
Just a quick question, or 2 quick questions.
Yes.
The 13,942, 5,000, that doesn't add up to the 32. Is that the transfer? Like, why is that number not jiving? Didn't we serve 32,000?
Yes. So again, very nuanced and shifting population. In order to have a student count, you have to have at least 2 assessments. So remember, we took in about...
Assessment? That was my second question. What are these assessments?
So the assessment is the WIDA Access for ELS assessment. This is...
you just described.
Yeah, this is the measurement that we see on the Maryland report card that says how our emerging multilingual learners are doing. There are 10 points for this assessment only on the Maryland report card that says your students grew or they didn't. So you have to have 2 consecutive assessments in order to show up in this category. So for our students who are coming in and taking the assessment for the first time, they don't count because they're establishing their baseline. For our students who take 3, there are four subtests of this assessment. For our students who take 3 but not 4, they don't get counted. So they don't have an opportunity to show growth. So and we're actually right now in the testing window. We are wrapping up this window. It's a massive effort to make sure that our middle and high schoolers, some of them refuse to take the assessment, and so they're counted as being in our student population, but not counted because we can't measure their growth per the assessment that is being used to demonstrate growth at the state level.
Okay. And so some students are just not counted in here.
Some students are not counted.
Because they either refuse or they're not, the ones that have only had 1 will get
counted next
round.
year. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Did you have other questions on this right now?
I mean, I could do it. Yeah.
Well, let's let them
hold- I
finish.
can
Let's
hold
let them
them,
finish. But at least I just want to.
yeah, I
I'm
got
trying to
you.
limit to questions of like understanding what's
Yes.
here, so and then we can ask other questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And then obviously the point is where all the growth is in the middle of high school is where we're struggling the most.
Yes.
And so, yeah,
Why are they not taking the assessment?
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry.
But, yeah.
Sorry, do
Okay.
we have
We're gonna
reasons
ask a
on
couple
why
questions
they're
on
not
this.
taking the assessment, just while we're on this right now?
Sure. Some of it is I'm a teenager and I just don't want to take this test, right? Some of it is our parents refuse services, which they have the legal right to do that. Sometimes we have families feel like they have to make a decision as to whether or not to receive services. So by law, you can refuse to receive services, but you still have to take the assessment. Okay, and those who refuse services feel like they don't have to take the assessment. So sometimes we do have parents who are advising not to participate, and the students are doing that. Sometimes some students get ill in the middle of the assessment window and they can't finish a subtest. Sometimes our students transfer to another county, and if the other county doesn't finish the assessment, then they're not counted. But because they started the assessment in our county, it counts for our end count. There's a host of reasons. We hear from our schools often who struggle with sometimes students just, not wanting to finish. And sometimes the reality is we have some students who have been in program for a long time, and they are just fatigued with, having to take this assessment and feeling as though there's like, I'm taking it, why it doesn't help me with graduation, it doesn't, it doesn't count against my GPA, there's a host of reasons for why a student may end up completing the whole battery of assessments.
How big of a population is that?
It's not huge. Last year, I want to say our non-test taker count was 800, in the 800s. It has increased over the years, but it's not the lion's share of our students.
They're still counted in how like our EML overall like performance stats.
Correct.
How the school. That's all. This is just on the WIDA
Yes.
language progress. Okay.
Yes.
Got it. Did you have a question on
Yeah.
this slide? Okay, good.
First, I just want to say that this is so helpful. You clearly really get this, so thank you. Could you just break down how this works in terms of like federal, state, local, like who's requiring what here?
Okay, so
And I know there's the connections to funding, and just kind of how does this work?
yes. So the federal government requires that we identify potential emergent multilingual learners upon enrollment into any U.S. school. So there's a lot of comparisons made about special education and English language development because both of our programs are federal programs. But I like to say most students are emergent multilingual learners before they become identified for special education services, because upon enrollment, every school by law is required to look at the Maryland Home Language Survey responses. And if a student has indicated a language other than English for 2 out of the 3 questions, they are, by law, federally required to be screened for services. So they become a potential EML just based on their responses to the Maryland Home Language Survey. The state requires us to follow the federal law, so as a school system, we do that. We look at the Maryland Home Language Survey, and at the beginning of the school year, we have 30 days to be able to sift through all the Maryland Home Language Survey responses, screen students, and identify whether or not they met the cut score based on the screener to be enrolled in program. Once the school year has started, you don't have 30 days. Once the school year has started, say a student comes in November, we have 10 days by law to be able to identify a student as an emergent multilingual learner and then put together a plan for them based on the accommodations they will need to receive services.
And and the screening that you do is the access test.
So the screening is a WIDA screener assessment, not to be confused with the WIDA Access for L's assessment. The screener comes from WIDA. Again, it's the same consortium, same company, but there is a screener version, and then there's the actual assessment. So all students who are in program would have gone through the WIDA screener for L's. There's a WIDA K screener version for kindergarten only, the WIDA screener for 1 through 12. And then once they have been identified for services, they are enrolled in our program. You cannot refuse to be enrolled in the program, but you can refuse to receive English language development services by an English language development teacher. And so we have slightly under 2,000 students across the district who refuse services K-12. We see most of our refusals in the high school level. And, sometimes students, once you are in program, then we by law have to provide services. And what that looks like at the middle and high school level is a course. And so you have a one period of your day is English language development. And so some families make the choice to free up their child's schedule so they can take an elective instead of English language development. That might be why a parent might refuse. They might want to do the IB program. This is something we're working on with schools. We don't want to shut students out of opportunities. That's one of the big ideas. So as a department, we're trying to figure out how we can provide those services to students so families aren't feeling locked into having to make a decision as such.
Okay, thank you. And then are both of those tests, the screener and the access test, did both of those include content or just the access?
They include content.
Okay.
Yes, it's the language for the content.
Okay.
That students are expected to show proficiency when they can demonstrate language for the content. Okay. So we have 5 standards, really. Social instructional language, which is kind of the umbrella, which is the tricky one, because if you can have a conversation, people think, oh, wow, this student's proficient. Well, that's, everyday social language. But there's language for math, language for science, language for social studies, and language for language arts. And every level you move at, the test bands change, and the language demands, the academic language expected to be used in 9th grade is not at the same level as a 3rd grader. So they're expected to use language for the content, which is why it's important that our classroom teachers also see themselves. That's the mindset work. That's the practices part of the big ideas. They also see themselves as language development teachers, not in the same way as an English language development teacher, but that they understand language is everywhere. And to an emergent multilingual learner, it might be opaque, when to them as a classroom teacher, it might be transparent. So we have to make language and content accessible in every classroom, not just the English language development course for middle and high schools or the language development services that the elementary teacher might provide.
Okay, this is so helpful, and I think we'll get to this later, but what is leaving me wondering is about the intersection between special ed and EML, and because obviously content acquisition is going to be different for special ed whether or not you're EML, and so the tracking and the pathway there, so.
Yes.
And obviously, there's intersection between all 3 of the groups. We haven't gotten to our farm students yet. Obviously, there are students that are in all 3, and it's 2 or 1, and there's obviously a lot of intersectionality here. So.
Yeah, I think that was one of the pieces that I neglected to frame at the beginning, is that our students who receive free and reduced meals are in both populations. So they are not segregated out for specific services. We can speak to the wraparound services and things that we have that are directly related to the funding that we spoke of at the beginning. But through here, the bulk of what you'll see today is the 2 big populations, because our farm students are across all.
All right, please continue.
Next slide. So this is, you guys are all proficient now in the WIDA Access for L's assessment. So what
WIDA doesn't mean anything.
WIDA just stands for WIDA, okay? You can be secure in saying that. Okay, so what we see here are our what we saw on the previous chart, just the growth, just visually represented a different way so that you can see really why we have to make some shifts in the levels we target. Next level, please. Next slide, please. And then here are our exits. So we outlined before, we had 2,924 exits. Again, a very great celebration, but you will see, again, the lion's share of the exits are in elementary school. And so when you think about our cohorted students, we've done internal studies to see how our students are progressing. And again, many of our students who start in kindergarten, they come in as a level 1 proficiency. So they're expected to spend most of their elementary career in program. And what we see is those who start with us in kindergarten, most of them exit. So of the 17,000, 18,000 that are at the elementary level, about 1,500 move up to middle school if they started in K. So that's internal work that we've done because we want to make sure that what's happening at elementary is moving our students. So that's working, and it could be better. We've been interrogating why we still have about 1,500 who move up to middle school, because what we see is those 1,500 who move up to middle school, they end up becoming long-terms, and they're the ones who end up in high school either refusing services or being fatigued about test taking. But then we have our middle schools where we had 6,270 test takers and 255 of them exited, and 7,036 test takers at the high school level and 384 of them exited. So again, just painting the picture for why as our student population needs change, we have to change with it and provide targeted supports. Next slide, please. So what we do as a system is one of our biggest levers is professional learning. We make sure, because we know that our teachers, they're begging, they're crying out for support. We know that we have first and second year ELD teachers, English Language Development teachers, who come to us by way of many different ways. They may have done an English Language Development program at the college level. They may have been a classroom teacher who got the certification by way of taking a test and taking a couple of courses. In either way, our teachers come to us, we ensure that we train them so that they have the latest research, the latest approaches in how to provide English language development services to our students. We make sure we're training K-12, all of our English language development services. So the learning that our first year and second year experience is different than the training we give to all of our teachers because they're in different places. And then there's things that all of our English language development teachers need to have. But we know we have to go beyond just our English language development teachers. We have to train our school-based teachers. And so we do a lot of shoulder-to-shoulder coaching. We go out to schools when a principal requests support. We work with the instructional leadership team. Over the past 2 summers, we were able to train our instructional leadership teams. The 2 summers ago, we trained our elementary, all 137 elementary school instructional leadership teams. So over 2,000 teachers we trained. And then this past summer was the first time, I think, ever, we were able to train our secondary instructional leadership team. So we had over 1,500 members participate. But we have to go beyond just the ILT teams. And so, these are the hopes and dreams of our department as we move forward and continue to work with our school-based partners. Next slide, please. And so we do also receive Title III funding. Title III funding is specifically for English language development. This funding is, we are required to use this funding not in a way that supplants but supplements. So this is what we do to go above and beyond what the operational budget level we can do. So some examples of how we've used our Title III funding. We've had authors of some very important research and texts come and work with our principals. You saw one of the big ideas was about the functional language approach, and we had an authority on a functional language come to work with our central office team. We trained the teachers who helped us facilitate the massive summer training we just did on a functional language approach. So we're getting firsthand knowledge from the best out in the field. So we're using some of our funds to be able to do that. We are working with our schools to provide specific resources. So, for example, last year, the state of Maryland started requiring our biology and government teachers to teach and our students to be assessed, and it counts for 20% of their grades. Now, we have EMLs in biology and NSL government who need to know the language for the content, and we need to be able to support them in being successful at, mastering these concepts. So we made an intentional decision to work with a vendor who provides language development for those two very courses, and our EMLs are getting exposure across 8 of our high schools that have our highest EML population. So we're using the funds, and we're thinking about who and what the needs are. And one of the groups of students we haven't necessarily spoken about are students with limited or interrupted formal education. We call that SLIFE. So if you look at the last column, we do have a segment of our students who, on top of coming to us, needing language development, they've had an interruption of 2 or more years in their schooling career. So our SLIFE, we start identifying SLIFE at grade 3. And so we have specific designated learning for our teachers who are teaching this specific group of students and making decisions around how math instruction happens, how literacy instruction happens, et cetera. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pugh.
So to wrap up and get to the discussion, we just really wanted to make sure that you understood the types of formal evidence-based interventions that we have available in schools. Not every student would need all of these things. That, again, as nuanced as the children are and as the data speak, it really is a diagnostic decision-making process to determine which interventions a student might need based on where they need additional support. So federally, and nationally, there's been a lot of attention around literacy for a number of years, and there are some really great products out there, and there are certainly more available than what is listed here that we're currently using. Mathematics has been much slower, not as much national attention on being fluent in mathematics by grade 3, and so much slower development in terms of mathematics interventions. But there are additional ones out there that we're interested in exploring. But currently, this is what we have for evidence-based interventions. Next slide. So to kind of wrap up for us, while we are working in the current context that we're working in across each of these populations, there are some things that are going to impact programming upcoming. The first one, obviously, is the literacy policy that MSDE just passed that talks about immediate notification of a student who is below grade level in reading, and then a collaborative plan developed with the parents and with the team that will be supporting the student, and then routine monitoring of that plan. There is a math policy that it either ended public comment yesterday or will be today. But there is a new math policy that MSDE is pushing forward. It has similar approaches. It's basically saying, when you notice a child is off track, you are responsible for responding, and we're going to hold you accountable by asking you to report back the data. So those 2 policies will change what we need to do in schools specifically. The other piece about the implementing the multi-tiered systems of support, we've worked with our school support team and partners to say, we have a multi-tiered system of support. Please use it to report and record the data. And again, just as nuanced, because we're already reporting the data for our special education students who are receiving special education services through their own individual IEP. So this would be for our non-special ed students as well who are receiving additional support. And so getting that up and operational and finding the time and the paraprofessionals who can be trained to help us monitor that progress is another significant lift that we're undergoing. This year we've got more schools using the system that we have, and so we're happy to see that. We know that there's more work that needs to be done. Again, providing the differentiated professional learning, rather than requiring an elementary teacher to go to a math training and then a literacy training and then an EML training and then a special education training and all of the culturally relevant and responsive trainings. We need to think of ways to do the differentiated professional development based on where an individual teacher needs more support. And then finally, as part of both of those policies, engaging with caregivers is critical, right? We have heard time and time again that our parents want to know where their children are. They want to know what's happening in school. They want to know what's available for them outside of school, what partners we're working with, and they want to be a part of it. What can we do at home to really help? And so that's another intentional build that will be continuing. And so with that, the next slide, I believe, is just a summary of what we just spoke of. So we can leave that up, and back to you for discussion.
Thank you. I think there'll be a lot of discussion, but this was good, and we kind of interjected a lot, and thank you for explaining as we go along. So I'll turn to Ms. Muir now, and then we will have a good bit of time for discussion.
Good morning. Thank you, Honorable Chair Joando and members of the Education Committee. I'm going to read my little blurb first, but first I want to say I really appreciate being at the table for this discussion and not being overlooked, because we are a large force of supplying this, bringing the supports for all these children. I'm Sally Murick, Vice President of Paraeducators Force SEIU Local 500, which represents over 10,000 educational support professionals from Montgomery County with over 5,000 paraeducators. And I'll pause right there. I just got current numbers. It's actually 5,200 paras. 620 of those, 23 of those, are what we call TPT, which is temporary part-time, where they receive no benefits. They show up to work every day, do the same work as everybody else, and a bulk of them are paid with that Medicaid funding when we get the reimbursement. So just trying to connect the dots there a little bit. I believe the superintendent has graciously put into the budget to make all our TPTs benefited positions, which is as they should be for the work they're doing and their recognition and respect. So I'll come back.
Sally, that was 600 TPT. How many?
623 as of yesterday. Okay. So I'm here to urge you, obviously, to fully fund the special education budget because of the needs of our special ed paras and our students who play that important role in supporting them. I was a paraeducator for 16 years in the schools, and I've been the paraeducator program manager for many years, and I've witnessed firsthand the impact that well-supported special education services can have on students' academic and personal development. MCPS has a responsibility to provide a high-quality education for every student, and that includes ensuring the students with disabilities and EML needs that receive individualized attention and the resources they need to succeed. However, despite the dedication of our special education teachers and paraeducators, chronic underfunding has left many students without adequate support academically, emotionally, and physically. Staff and students are being injured as often the staffing ratios are inadequate or vacancies cannot be filled. Special education paraeducators are the backbone of disability services, yet they are often underpaid, overworked, and stretched thin across too many students. Without sufficient staffing and compensation, these paraprofessionals who provide direct, hands-on assistance to students with disabilities cannot effectively meet the complex needs of the children they serve. I urge this committee to fully fund the special education services, including funding the superintendent's budget for the para reclassification study as a line item in there, to actually raise the compensation for the classification of the paras that are working with providing services for discrete students, and so that we can meet our federal and state mandates. If we can't hire because we're not paying enough, or they're hiring and they're leaving when they see the work, it's a revolving door. So we can't support. And I know we want to hire as many special ed teachers as we can. We got to find them. And we're working on that. We're growing our own. We're working with partnership universities. We're seeking out many areas. But meanwhile, our students are here now. And we can get paras here now if we pay them and keep them and train them. We need to invest in them by providing the competitive wages, professional development opportunities, and adequate staffing levels to prevent burnout, high turnover, and injuries. We need to improve classroom support structures to ensure that students with disabilities receive the individualized attention and accommodations they need to thrive. By fully funding special education and investing in the professionals who work directly with our students, we are not only fulfilling a legal obligation, we are making a moral commitment to inclusivity, equity, and excellence in our schools. I also wanted to add, there was a couple of little notes I was taking along the way, that the number that Ms. Wiles shared about the identified numbers, 24,403 as of this time, does not include all the students that are currently going through assessments and evaluations to determine if they need services. And many of those children can be disruptive, have learning gaps, have needs while they're going through this process to possibly end with an IEP. And that process can take up to 9 months. So basically it's a school year where disruptions can be happening in classrooms, which is, again, where paras come in. So the number is actually, you can think of it as larger than that 24,000. The other things we have to remember are the impacts that the blueprint is going to have. One in particular is the CDA license to work with 3- and 4-year-olds. It is originally was a 2-year process. We're working to see if we can make it a 1 year to see if we can service, but MSDE is saying no, no, no to a lot of things. And there's going to be a cost involved to getting the paras that currently work with our 3- and 4-year-olds or who may want to work with our 3- and 4-year-olds have to meet this requirement as a state law. So that is another price point that we have to look at, and as we encourage and recruit and retain paras for what's happening. And I'll wait for questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Merrick, and thank you to all of you for presenting and providing in the packet a lot more information that, I know you can, and thank you for you've been hovering at 20 slides, so I appreciate that. So that's always, it's always appreciated. There's a lot that you could talk about. All right, I'll kick us off, and then I'll just turn to my colleagues and see where this goes. So in the packet, and I want you to just speak to this. You've alluded to it, but and I know it was in your October board presentation, and we saw little snippets of how students are doing. But the big question is, like, what direction are we heading, and how rapidly, and do we think that these interventions that we're putting in place are going to move us in the other direction? Because when I look at the data, as you look at it, of course, it seems we're not heading in the right direction for a lot of the data. So, I know that's a big question. It's the question, but how do you help me contextualize that, and what interventions, what's required to move us in the right direction? What's not working right now? Why are we not moving in the right direction? That one slide that you had up, if we could go back to it for a second, Doug, that showed, yeah, that one. Keep going forward. One more. That one. This is just one population where over the last 3 years, we've gone down in every category, every group of students for EML learners, right? Am I reading that right? Right. So obviously there's context to this. We're getting more older kids, as you mentioned. We're coming out of, there's a lot of, so just help me start answering that question, and I'm sure colleagues will want to chime in on this too.
So, thank you for the question. I mean, it is the question of the day, right? Is what we're doing working, and how do we know, and where are we headed next? I think what we've seen is persistently flat data, but then I also want to go back and re-examine part of this EML data. The intentionality is that group changes, right? So the group is not a year-over-year progress. And the intention is that students would not be identified as part of that group. And so this group will persistently have a gap with their general ed peers who are not receiving language services. Because as soon as they no longer need services, they are now part of the other group, right? And so I just want you to see, you're not going to see EML student grow year over year, but what Ms. Hewlett shared today is we're hoping the students grow and planning for the students to grow year over year to meet those targets and exit. So that's why we share with you the access data, because that is our measure of are students moving through and exiting. And as what you saw, our elementary students are moving through and exiting, many of them. Our secondary students do not have as much time, and there's adolescent complications with providing those services in the structures we have. So we have to examine those structures. Both the disparities between both populations, they're not new, but we do believe we can address them. We do believe that with the appropriate training for all adults who are working with the student and the responsibility of implementing those for all.
Because you put a very compelling slide that said basically all the adults are not getting trained.
Correct.
They're not getting trained before they come to you, and they're not getting trained very limited when they are to you for time. So let's talk about that. Like, that's a key thing, right? You got to, the adult that's interacting with a student that is in poverty or special ed or EML needs to have training. That's like number one. So what are we doing? We obviously can't fix the colleges of education. I mean, we can advocate, but what are we doing and what's in the way of training our current staff and teachers now?
So I'll start big and then ask each one to speak to their group. So in Montgomery County, we do a lot of the training in the summer. And that is an expensive endeavor because no one is compelled to come in the summer except for Tier 1 training. So we do get out between all of the groups who have information to help teachers implement what they're to do to determine what is required Tier 1 training that every teacher will get. And so that's also an expensive endeavor because you're paying them their full teaching salary for that day and pulling them in the summer. But again, we know best practice says one and done doesn't work. You need to be able to provide maybe that initial training that everyone has and then do the ongoing training. And so there are structures in each group to be able to do some ongoing training. It is what I'll call it more of a train the trainer, right? So we have the big training, we have the leaders, we have the experts in the area who are then relying on the structure within a specific school to be able to have access to support the teachers who need them. So give
is
more.
EML and special ed for these teachers considered Tier 1 every summer, every year? Sounds like no, but you didn't really say that.
We would love for it to be, and as Dr. Pugh outlined, it's budget pending. So last summer we trained as many teachers as we can based on the funds that we had, and so what we did was we trained the instructional leaders of the departments, right? So hoping that
First time ever.
for the first time, for secondary, first time. But our data is saying that's what needs to happen. So this summer we have put forth, our department has put forth a training, budget pending, to focus in on our high school social studies teachers, for example. And so we're waiting, we're going through the channels and working through with our unions and all of those to approve the training. But originally, we wanted to train all of our secondary social studies teachers. Again, funding is limited, and so we narrowed it to our high school so that we can ensure that our high school teachers who are working with our students who have end-of-course assessments, who are that one final push to get them across the graduation finish line. Everybody's responsible for graduation. K-12, everyone's responsible for getting our students to graduation. But when we have to make choices, we made the choice to focus on our secondary, high school social studies teachers. But that's just one segment of teachers, right? So we have science, we have, so it's going to be a multi-pronged, multi-year effort to be able to train our staff, and given also the amount of staff we have to be able to do that. So there's a lot. It's a lot of budget pending.
Budget pending. Is what you're describing included in the board passed budget?
What she is describing for this year is in this year's budget.
That was so not the one going next year. So in the one that just passed, what's in there for training? How much would you be able to do if you got it all? You might not, because we have to figure that out. But
Yeah,
what was in there for that?
It would be
Similar to what you did. So just kind of one set of folks.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so, again, one and done is not okay. And so what our department has done is doing a lot of follow-ups with schools. We work with the English language development resource teachers and content specialists at the middle and high school levels. So we continue to train them in the structure that we have, where we meet with them monthly. But we're also working across office because what we do is a program. We're a program, and we overlay all contents, all other programs. So we have to ensure that our content area leads are also embedding language development instruction when they are out working with their constituents as well. So we do a lot. We have to be in a lot of places all the time. And so, that's
So our ELD students are how much of our population?
over 20%.
Okay. And that's identified.
And that's identified. That's not ever. And I want to say it's important to understand that just because a student exits at a 4.5, that does not mean they have total command of English.
You anticipated one of my other questions because I was digging into the thing, and even exiters are not doing as well as we'd like to see. That means they've exited, they have the language capacity, but if you look at the scores here, it looks
Well, actually, our recently exited students are doing better. They tend to outperform our native English speakers. That's not only happening in Montgomery
all
County.
age grade? At all age levels?
It's not at all age levels and not in all contents, but they eventually.
Where's that? Where's that chart?
So if you look, for example, in the math data, for example, you'll see the emergent multilingual categories, and then you'll see the recently exited. And so again, we have to, by law, track our recently exited students for 2 years. So we continue to serve the students who are in program, and we have to monitor the students who are recently exited for 2 years. If we're seeing they're struggling, then we can have some conversations and do some observations.
You're saying the recently exited are outperforming?
Our recently exited tend to outperform our total population.
Right, which aren't, well, obviously we have struggles there too. So,
Yes.
But, okay,
Yes.
got it.
Yes.
Okay.
But at the state level, across the state, we're also seeing that. So when students make it through the English language development program, they actually do fare well. When they have enough academic English to be able to exit. But we also have to still monitor those students because we exit at a 4.5, but the total proficiency scale is at a 6.0.
Got it. All right.
So.
Well, thank you. I know you could keep going. It's a lot. I'm gonna go to 11, and then I'm gonna kick the colleagues. We'll do it in like 10-minute chunks or whatever, something like that. Yes. I don't want to forget about special ed. Yes, you're over there.
Professional learning is even more challenging for special education because one of the things you have to think about is we're not just teaching teachers how to teach students with disabilities. We also have to teach special educators how to do the paperwork and the evaluations and how to access, whatever the resources are. So our professional learning budget is usually embedded in our IDEA grants. And we have to make choices each summer when we do our planning for summer training. So many times our tier one training is for example, our non-diploma teachers and how they are using the resources to access the curriculum for students who are working towards a certificate. It may be to provide training for crisis prevention, intervention, de-escalation. This coming summer, we have to start planning because they are changing the evaluation tool we use to identify students for special education. We use the Woodcock-Johnson 4. They're converting to the Woodcock-Johnson 5. So that's going to be a huge undertaking, and that is the tool that we use to determine if students are eligible to receive services. So we have to roll that training out to all special educators who have to test students. So in a small pot of money, we have to make decisions about what, is the most pending, most important, significant issue at the time. We do embed within the content areas professional learning. So, for example, with the rollout of the new curriculum, CKLA in elementary this year, the goal was to have some special education embedded in how you are instructing your students with disabilities, embedded in those trainings, so that we're not pulling out special educators and saying this is what you do with this group of students, and then separately saying to general educators this is what you do, because they're in the classrooms with their non-disabled peers. Ultimately, it's time. I think your question was what's not working. We don't have the time, nor do we have the resources. If we did have the time to pull general educators the way we needed to, we don't have the subs to cover the classes so that they can get the time to get the professional learning that they need. So a lot of it is school-based. If a principal says, I need help with a teacher that has just started, or I have vacancies, or my general educators need to understand how to work with specific students, then our central office instructional specialists and supervisors are out in the schools shadowing, observing, coaching teachers on very specific ways that they can work with their classes. And that tends to be the best way because they're learning in real time. But that is hard to do in 211 schools.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And yes, Ms. Muir, go ahead.
I'd like to add in about the professional development opportunities for paraeducators. Slim to none. It's basically only what I can provide. And they're working the most directly with our students to reaffirm first instruction, to work one-on-one, small groups, support, enrich, whatever the need might be. My little office, we can, because of the nature of paras, which are hourly employees, I can provide after school, usually 4:30 to 6:30, professional development system-wide. I encourage teachers to come, and I pay the teachers to deliver a training on specific topics to try to reach as many paras as I can, but it's all voluntary. And like I said, they can only be paid $20 an hour for a certain number of hours of PD a school year. And it's hard because a lot of these folks that are hired to work with our most in need students to provide services and accommodations, they don't know how to do it until, and there's not built-in time to access them during the school day, especially in secondary schools where they're working by class period and bell times. They're assigned every period of the day. Sometimes in elementary schools, the principals can find an hour once a month to pull paras together for some specific training. It's tricky, but it's easier. It can be done better there than when you're dealing with periods. It's a guessing game, and it's just whatever we can do, balls in the air, and try to do the best you can.
Yeah, I'll say this and then I'll pass it to colleagues. Ms. Pugh, you started with this because I think you think it's a high priority issue, right? You dedicated a slide. We get pressure, rightly so, from the public and from, parents and others, and to why aren't we delivering results, particularly for our highest need students. And we're talking about, those students today, but I think you could apply this to every student because, again, we got a lot of inclusion happening here. And we're basically saying we need more time for training for the people, and we're getting basically none, and it's a hope and a prayer to get some. And then we expect to see the data change. It's in no other field would we do this way. And I wish I could help people understand that. It's difficult. So I'm going to turn. Do you want to go first? I'm going to turn. So we're going to do seniority, you know, and less verboseness probably. But
We're going to go round and round this way.
we're going to come back. So you got as until 11:15 if you want, and then we'll go to Councilmember Mink.
Yeah, and you know.
You can go back and forth. Yeah, we'll go back and forth. Yeah.
So, and I'm not going to ask all my questions in one chunk.
Perfect.
I promise. But I'll start from this place. I so appreciate the way that you framed your comments in talking about the assets and the treasures that these students are. We talk about deficits, we talk about problems, we can't be blind to them, but that's exactly what they are. They are treasures and they are assets to our community, not just their own families. So thank you for that, especially right now. My God, what we're dealing with is just evil. So I'll start with this. Last year, at the end of the school year, we got the truancy updates, and both populations, special education, EML, were significantly disproportionately truant. Do we have any data so far this school year? Are those trends still a problem? Because what we heard last time was we have these constructs. There's not enough training. There's not enough programs. But if kids aren't even showing up to classes or school, then we don't even have a fighting chance of being able to provide their needs, support their needs.
So I don't have exact numbers. I do know that our numbers are lower this year than last year, and we are in the political environment that we are. We monitored for the first couple of weeks since January 20th what our enrollment for our emerging multilingual learners were. It was actually stable. And I would attribute that to the work that we did as a system in reaching out to our families to assure them that school is a safe place to be. We were worried that the numbers would fall off. Some schools did see some fluctuation, but for the most part, they were pretty stable. And in some cases, lower absenteeism than there was at that time last year. I don't have the numbers. It still continues to be a concern, but I attribute that to our students need a sense of belonging, and they need to feel as though they are welcomed, appreciated, and have a space in our schools. And that goes to the mindset practices arm of the WIDA framework. And so that's work that our entire system needs to do to make sure that our emerging multilingual learners feel welcomed. They understand that school is kind of going to be their pathway to moving forward in career and college. And they have a person, you know, like every student needs to have a person. You know, that's work that we continue to do. But I don't have exact numbers, but I do know that as we monitored, you know, this past month, it has been actually stable, which is promising.
That's great. And the last time we had a session, I publicly acknowledged, I think you all are a national model in how to communicate with parents, particularly under the current circumstances. I was really, really appreciative of how you handled that at the beginning of the school year. It's a big deal. But that tees up my next question. So obviously the other layer to this is the social and emotional aspect of not just the learning and content, which is critical and difficult on a good day, but you layer that with the social and emotional needs of these students in particular. For example, among many, those students that have experienced trauma, have parents in diverse documentation, and so there's just a lot of concerns sort of across the board. So, but we know that extracurricular activities and other support services are part of this equation. So how are we working on connecting these students so that they do feel like they belong, so that there are other things that help them feel connected and things that they can look forward to that make it more likely that they will show up for school. I know we've extensively done evaluation of Excel Beyond the Bell over the years, and it shows conclusively that students that actively participate in that program are more likely to show up for school, more likely to be engaged. So how are we making those connections? And I know it's hard, but is there some formal process by which we're doing it?
So let me start macro, and then we can talk specifically. So there are some new structures in the state of Maryland, relatively new structures in the state of Maryland that speak to that concept of wraparound services, right? Typically, schools were academic places, and that's what you could expect to get. It was a number of years ago, legislatively, that they said, no, schools are going to connect families to community resources in a way that provides wraparound services that are so desperately needed by so many of the families that we serve. And so that's the Community Schools Initiative. And I'm not the expert on community schools, but what I do know about it is that as it has evolved through the blueprint and the funding, is each school does their own needs assessment. And within that needs assessment, their community speaks to what it is that they need and how they need to invest. And so through community schools, we've been able to lift up many partnerships with community groups who offer that level of support that you're speaking of that helps a student feel engaged and also meets a need of the family. So that is a new layer, a new added piece. I also feel like the in-school supports that we have, giving them the access and knowledge of how to connect with these. So we have out-of-school time opportunities that are available. We have out-of-school time vendors that are offering services that we partner with on a sort of an annual basis. We're also actively seeking grants and trying to be able to fund school-specific programs, for example, the 21st Century Learning Grants, which were targeted in specific schools to help address some of that concept of belonging. It's also a part of the school's school improvement plan because it is part of their, and I forget the name of the survey, but there's a state survey about how your students feel in terms of being culture and climate in their schools. And so that information is then used by schools to target what it is that they feel that they need to better meet that goal of the students, be it partnering every student with an adult, a caring adult, which we know works amazingly, or is it a program, an after-school specific program that's needed based on what the data say. So that's the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I would add is around the individual human capital. I love to talk about the SLIFE coaches that I have on my team. I have 6 SLIFE coaches. So they work specifically with our students with limited or interrupted formal education at the elementary level. And they really get to know the students who have experienced, many of those students have experienced trauma on their way to the United States, and then even when they get to the United States are experiencing trauma, whether it is being rehoused, in the middle of the day, whether it is not receiving services that were promised to them. So for us, it's really about knowing everybody's story and knowing how to support. We also work really closely with the International Admissions Enrollment Office, where the EML transition counselors are present, and so they provide services. Our offices work together because if a SLIFE coach, for example, we know that we have an incoming student, they automatically will get at least one touch point with an EML transition counselor. But if we're seeing something else, it's all about the coordination of the resources during the school day. But that often bleeds outside of the school day as we enroll our parent community coordinators, as we work with our pupil personnel workers. So it's, from my perspective, from the curriculum and instructional standpoint, it's all about ensuring that our teams are communicating with each other on behalf of our students and families.
One thing that I would add is that we do have opportunities for intramural athletics for our students to have some of our more significant disabilities, where they can participate in some athletics on teams where they may not, be able to meet the criteria to be on the basketball or the football team. But it's an excellent opportunity for students to feel more of a part of their school community who may not otherwise be able to participate in some of the activities that our students without disabilities would.
Love that. I'm going to get back in the queue. Next batch of questions I'm going to ask.
Can
when
I
when
interrupt
get
one
back.
more
Of
thing?
course, of
Along
course.
that
Yeah,
same
yeah.
line, I'm just going to keep pushing myself in.
You're in.
That's what I do. We have floated for 2 years now, I believe, in contract negotiations to extend a para in the school from 7 hours to 8 hours for exactly that purpose. They could be there to support a student that might need more adult support to participate in an extracurricular activity. And on days that they might not be supporting a student in a club or an activity or something, they could help deliver professional development right on site at the school. And we would train these cadre of people to be, and support them with training plans and delivery to get things down. They haven't bitten on it yet, but just want to put that in there. We're trying to be proactive as to, and who are the people that are working with these students closely every day that a family member could trust with them, or the student themselves feels confident to stay and join clubs and that type of thing.
I appreciate that. That's good. The next batch of questions I'll ask when I get back in the queue is regarding communication. The Black and Brown Coalition had a series of recommendations on how to expand communication to families, specifically families of special education and EML students. Just want to see how that's going and what their updates are on that, but I'll get back in the queue.
Thank you, Councilman Ravenous. All right, Councilmember Mink, your chunk.
Great. All right. Thank you. This is a really informative conversation, so very much appreciate it, and I really appreciate the level of detail that we're getting into. I think that it's important, and I think that it's important that the public understands that there are things that we would like to fund that we aren't able to fund, and that we're just transparent about that. That's the situation that we're in, and I think the public wants that level of transparency, and we're all disappointed by not having the funding that we want, but we can all be disappointed together and talk about the pathway that we want to take moving forward. So I appreciate that. Really appreciate the line of questioning that Councilmember Albornoz just took us down in terms of factors that impact student learning that aren't obviously academic in nature. Back in, let's see, the end of fall of 2024, September 2024, when we were looking at literacy performance and academic improvements and so on, I cited at that time a July 11th presentation from MCPS that listed several bullet points that are kind of the top reasons that schools might have lower academic performance. And top on that was high rates of chronic absenteeism. And so as we talk about these issues, and also social emotional needs, second on that list. So as we talk about these issues, I think it's so important to keep those top of mind, that it's not just, it's all of these things. We need the training, we need the staffing, we need all of those pieces, we need the right curriculum, right? But we also need those kids to be in the school building and, ready and able to learn from a, kind of basic services, mental health perspective. And, that's a lot, but being able to kind of break down those silos in terms of the data presentation, I think is really going to benefit us and help us to understand, how to prioritize funding in some places as well when we show that, these various programs that might not obviously be directly tied to academic performance, some of our extracurriculars. If those are the programs that are helping kids stay in school, then that should be considered as one of the things that we should be funding in order to improve academic performance. That can go into our arts programs, into our athletics programs. Not that they're the lowest funded on the list, but I think it is important for us to be really looking at that level of detail to make some of these decisions. Was wondering also about the immersion programs and how our EML kids do when they have access, when they're in an immersion program versus not in an immersion program, if that's something that you have been looking at, tracking.
Thank you for your question. So two-way immersion is in our department. One-way immersion is not. So just to make sure that we draw that distinction, our one-way immersion program is under world languages, and we don't have a lot of emergent multilingual learners in our one-way immersion program. In our two-way immersion program, we do have a lot of emergent multilingual learners in the program by nature of the schools where the programs sit. So we have 6 two-way immersion schools. 5 of them are Title I schools, and 1 of them is not. Our emergent multilingual learners seem to be holding pace with emergent multilingual learners in similar demographic schools. The plus, however, is many of those students are maintaining their home language. So it looks as though they're moving along in their trajectory of English around a similar pace as peers in non-two-way immersion schools, but the added benefit is the connection to language and culture remains for many of those students. So that's not always evident in the data. We are trying to attain a Spanish proficiency assessment because our program is, all 6 of our programs are English-Spanish programs. So we are in the midst of attaining a Spanish proficiency to be able to elevate Spanish proficiency for our students as well, but they seem to be faring for their language proficiency similarly.
That's really interesting. I mean, when you think about the employability, for example, of students who exit with multiple languages, I mean, that's a huge impact in terms of what level of income potentially those kids could have access to simply by being able to maintain their home language, which obviously also has all of those cultural benefits. And, I'm sure there's social emotional things that we can tie in and family connection and all of that. But I'm just thinking about, the connections that we can use to defend getting money from, the government, including the county government. If we talk about, workforce transition, all of those pieces, that seems like a big piece for us to keep an eye on.
It's important to know that right now our two-way immersion program is only in our elementary schools. Mm-hmm. We do have a mandate from Blueprint to try to scale two-way immersion programs. We do have some implementation kinks we need to work through because really there's not a lot of biliteracy curricula out there. So working with experts in the field to ensure that, for example, if we just talked about our emergent multilingual learners, if I know the concept of, multiplying fractions and knew the language to communicate that in my home language, which may not be English, I don't need to learn that concept again. It's really I need to learn the language to be able to communicate effectively about that concept. Mm-hmm. So understanding the heavy lift that our two-way immersion schools and our teachers have to do to ensure that, one, they're not necessarily teaching everything twice. The premise is once you learn it once well the first time, what you need is language to bridge over to the other language, whether it's English to Spanish or Spanish to English, to be able to securely be able to communicate about that learning. So our program was one of the first set of schools in the state. We're seeing other counties start dual language programs as well. And so we've had the wonderful pleasure of learning, along the way what is working and what's not working in terms of implementation in those programs. So as we continue to make the tweaks necessary to turn our programs to flagship programs, we are seeing, and our families are telling us how much they love being a part of these programs. You see a lot of community engagement from our families because they can come into the school and language in a language where they're understood, they feel honored, they feel a part of the community, etc. So, you know, navigating, shoring up the programs we have, navigating the ask from Blueprint to continue to scale, because we do have communities where at least 50% of the population can language in Spanish and English. Those are prime sites for adding additional programs, yet we are trying to ensure that we're responding in kind to the academic data we're seeing coming out of the schools, and making sure everyone understands. And this is work that you know, me and my team we're doing with the state, because it's easy to say implement this program without guardrails and without guidance about what the research shows. So research shows that for two-way immersion programs, the achievement data is not going to look the same for our students until they hit about 4th or 5th grade. But our students are being held to the same achievement standards in our two-way immersion schools than our monolingual schools are being held. Those are the types of things. The catch-up comes around 4th, 5th grade. That's what research shows across the nation. However, if we're expecting our students to hit the exact targets, when they're learning too, I mean, you know, their dual language programs are actually enriched programs, right? They're learning in 2 languages. They need the time to be able to move through that language learning and not be held in the same way for a monolingual student who is learning in English all day to hit those same targets. So those are also things we have to push on the state for. And so there's a work group that, you know, we're a part of to try to ensure that the state, you know, it's easy to say scale the programs, but where are the assessments? Where's the research? Where's the guidance that shows and is in alignment with research so that our schools understand that if I don't hit 4 stars and I'm a two-way immersion school, we understand why. We know, and here's the trajectory. You know, our team is working to create a bilingual trajectory. We're analyzing a few years worth of data and seeing what are the typical rates of growth for English, for Spanish, because that's really the trajectory of language development in both of those languages in the context of a dual language program. And then how do we as a system respond in kind? So there's a lot of work that we're doing to shore up our two-way immersion programs. But we're seeing benefits. The community definitely is responding positively to the program by and large. Of course, there are questions.
I mean, there's huge wait lists, right, for those.
Well, so our two-way immersion program is not a lottery program.
Oh, that's the one way.
Yes, that's the one way. Yeah. So two-way immersion, you are, by nature of being in that community,
Right.
you are able to attend that school with some caveats depending on the grade level that you enter.
Well, as the state works to catch up, it would be, you know, it might be helpful for us the way that we look at the data, for us to be able to look at those, you know, the data coming out of those schools for those kids separately, to be able to look at kind of that longer pathway so that we're judging it, you know, in a way that makes sense. You know, hopefully the state will catch up as well. And then also thinking about the dramatic increase in the EML kids who are coming in secondary schools now, and kind of the unique needs that brings. And, you know, there's social emotional needs that come along with that. But there's also, you know, learning styles and the way that the brain works at that age and so on, that's different. And I don't know what the data shows in terms of immersion programs for kids coming in at that level. Do you know?
So nationally, it is encouraged to have a K-12 approach to dual language. The students do well. You know, when you remove language as a barrier, the kids, you know, the students can come in and just start continuing to learn. So, you know, it's an eventual goal to scale the programs up through middle, high school. We just want to make sure we're doing it well in our elementary schools first.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that the goal already matches what the needs of our population are, and certainly puts a spotlight on the importance of us making sure that we're working towards that to accommodate that population. And I'm going to get back in the queue to talk about special ed, the special ed population, but I'll note also, and I appreciate you referencing the work with the international office. And this came up actually just at our last ENC and HHS meeting as well, that they're seeing cuts to ETCs in particular. And as Mr. Monteleone mentioned, those are positions that are technically under the central office umbrella, but those are staff who are in the schools the majority of the time. They're assigned to various schools, and we're losing half of those currently, including some who are the only people who speak that particular language, including some of the population, the language that matches some of our highest needs populations, where we've really seen dramatic increases in the last couple of years. Pashto, I think Arabic, I have the list, but so I think that that's a really important piece that we think about and make sure that we have the structures to deal with what that's going to look like. In conversations with the superintendent, he mentioned retaining those folks as social workers potentially, which makes sense given the type of work that they do. However, now if they're limited to one school, if you have somebody who speaks that one language, for example, they're just at that one school, you've got other schools who have high populations of those language speakers who don't have access to that person if they're locked in there. So I just think that structurally this is something that needs to be really carefully considered so that we still maintain the change that was put in place with the international office just a couple of years ago, and I know that was from outside funding, but to have those ETCs, the email transition counselors, that was in response to a need, and this is nobody's fault here, so I'm putting it out into the world, but that was in response to the need that was seen on the ground of these students coming through the international office, ending up in schools, and then the needs bubbling up in conflicts, in academic performance, and various social emotional ways, and then those schools then reaching back out to the international office to try to solve the problem, and there was a realization that there needed to be a transition process and somebody who went with that student and helped to make sure that they were plugged into all the services and so on, and get them settled. And now we're removing that, and where does that leave us? As we have dramatically increasing numbers within this population, and now those kids are losing federal support, so the needs are only going to get greater. So I put that out there. I just want to keep elevating that conversation because I think that's a problem that we're going to have to figure out how to solve within a very tight budget.
I can respond really tangentially to what you're saying. Mm-hmm. You think about where we are in Blueprint, right? Blueprint was a complete transformative law that was intended to substantially change pre-K to college experiences for children. And I like to describe where we are as in the messy middle. All right, all of those well-intended, thought out, research-based pieces, we're doing those and everything we've always done. And so there's a concept that we just talked about it at a state meeting in D.C. yesterday called strategic abandonment. At some point, you cannot afford to do both, everything you've always done and reorient to a new trajectory. So while we're not talking specifics about the budgets, we are very clear about laying out what the needs are. You'll see the budget coming forward to you on, I guess, Friday, right? Is that this week? Budget's coming to you. And I think what you'll find is the superintendent, 14th. The superintendent and team will be able to explain what is being designed moving forward and why. But it is hard. You just logistically in the messy middle cannot do everything that you have to do and do everything that you've always done.
I appreciate that, but I don't know that like keywords are like help us solve the problem here. Like we don't, fundamentally the messy middle means we don't have the money and we're cutting stuff that we need and that is useful. So like let's just be very transparent about that, and then there has to be what is the plan? There's not a plan. I've asked. There's not a plan that really impacts the problem that I just identified. Them being social workers assigned to one school doesn't address this issue. So let's just be transparent about that, and also let's figure out what are we telling schools and what are we telling families to do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Really appreciate that. And I just want to lift up both my colleagues. I love my committee. This is a great committee, and this has been a great conversation. I want to lift up something Councilman Ramnath said. Actually, both my colleagues said. We have amazing kids and families, and every kid can learn. I can hear it in the passion in which all of you talk about your work and interactions. Obviously, but we're all starting in different places, and we all need different things. And some things are more effective than others, and some things take more time. And also it's hard in the middle, and we're in the, education transformation in general, right? There's things we need to adjust, and how we get the public and ourselves to realize what that adjustment needs to be. That's a tough transition, and we're in it right now. We're literally in it. But we know each day that there's kids and families that need us to accelerate the pace in which that we get them what they need. Let's talk about staffing a little bit. Just be please really honest with me, with us, with the public, the millions watching at home that I like to say, about for your respective areas, and I've talked to the superintendent about this, I think we took up a special education appropriation an hour ago just to scrape by to meet the staffing levels where they are in special ed, right? So talk about the staffing complement and what we have versus what you think is required to make meaningful progress. So I talked about training, because I'm trying to identify what are the impediments, what are the things that we need to adjust to make sure we're making population. I think staffing's one of them, but I'll let you tell me what you think. Let's start with special education.
I knew you were coming to me. Staffing is probably the number one issue that we're facing. And this year, we were fortunate. We were able to bring in international teachers, and that filled a gap.
It's like Philippines, right?
From the Philippines, correct. It significantly helped us to close the gap of teacher vacancies, where right now we're at about 25 to 30 teacher vacancies. Last year, we may have been around 80 at this time.
That's for special educator teachers,
special
not para.
education
This is
teachers,
special
not
education
paras.
teachers.
Right.
Okay.
Whether or not we'll be able to do that again next year, as of now, because of the federal situation that we're facing, we may not be able to. So that lends the question, where do we find the teachers that we need with the growth that we continue to have with identification of students and just the increasing need that we see with our students. We really have to rely on the partnerships that we have with colleges and universities, and we do have some good partnerships. It's slow going. We probably graduate a handful of teachers that are paras in the system through some of the universities in the area. We also have a partnership with University of Maryland for speech and language pathologists, which is a huge area where we use contractual services because we can't hire enough SLPs. Other districts are struggling even more than we are in Montgomery County. There's no magic bullet. When I speak to people in higher education, the tremendous issue is that people are not going to school to teach. Montgomery County is facing what other districts have faced over the last 2 decades, where you are having to bring in people who don't have the training in higher education to teach. They're changing careers. And so we have to build in systems that when we are recruiting, we are providing the support that teachers need to learn on the job how to do the job. I was one of those teachers that came in and did not go to school to teach. And I was fortunate to have people around me that taught me what I needed to do to become a good, not just a good teacher, a good special educator. So those are the things that we think about, that we plan for within our department. How do we support our provisionally certified, conditionally certified teachers so that we can retain them?
That gets back to the training question.
It gets back. It's all related. It's all related. As Ms. Merrick pointed out, the strong hope is that if we're able to, one, convert a number of temporary part-time positions to permanent para positions.
Which is part of the current budget proposal.
Correct. That we'll be able to draw in additional staff because they'll be benefited positions, but also with the para study and the tiered pay for paras, that we'll be able to attract people. Where we find the most challenges is the para positions for our students that have some very, very significant behaviors that may need to be, that, are not toilet trained, or that have some significant social emotional issues, that have significant behavioral issues. But again, it's all relative. We need the time to train them. When a principal is able to fill a position in the middle of the year for a paraeducator that the vacancy has been 2, 3, 4 months, then they're coming right on the job without having that onboarding time. And that's the time that we need to be able to support them in learning how to de-escalate, how to, manage a classroom, how to manage behaviors, how to work with a student, how to not set off a student that doesn't like to hear loud noises, or, that just may need to walk in the hall for a minute to calm themselves. So it's a lot of factors. There's no one way to solve the issue of staffing in special education. We have to develop more partnerships with colleges and universities, and we have to articulate to them that there needs to be a shift in how teachers are trained coming out of school.
You've mentioned several things that we've talked about before, and I just want to highlight them. One, growing our own, right? Like I have a 7th grader who is a special education student who has now said to me she wants to be a teacher.
Awesome.
Okay, so I know it gives me chills too. And a special education teacher. So my job, I'm hopeful I can help her navigate how to get there. But I will say, as the chair of the education committee for the county, I'm not exactly sure what that pathway is for her as I sit right here. So I know if I'm not sure, the students and families aren't sure. I know, Sally, you're going to tell me what the pathway is. But my point being that she will get in that, and I'm speaking. But how do we grow our own from the kids themselves, right? And be really intentional about that, because she's 12 years old and 7. I know she's not alone in loving her paras and seeing that she has seen this because she's had the experience and now wants to do it. So that's one. 2, the paras themselves, as you said, how do we get them, the ones who want to continue on? And I know we have some of that naturally happening, but how do we incentivize, compensate, do that? So that's another strategy. 3, you mentioned that we're having to rely on people who aren't teachers like yourself that are coming into the profession maybe secondarily, which has always been a pathway, but even increasingly more now. I think we're in a unique moment for that population, given what's happening at the federal level, given what's happening in the world, given that we have a third of our residents are foreign-born, where we need to be leaning in even more heavily than we are on that strategy. Because we can't change, we can partner all we want. We can't change that people aren't going to school to be educators. The reason is because they don't get paid and they don't get respected, and we know the reasons for that. now what we can do is we can pay and respect our teachers and educators better to help create more of a pipeline. But in the immediate term, these people who are going to need jobs and who are doing other things who can transition. So my question would be, in each of the, I think we should have a line of, and I know we have some of it, but like we should have a defined strategy that we're talking about with each other and with the public and that we're funding in each of these, and there's probably more than those three I just mentioned, in each of those areas so that we can create more pipeline. Because that is a part of the staffing. Because when we don't have that, we have to rely on the contractual services. We end up paying more for things that we're legally required to do in the context of these special populations. So I want to mention that and I want to get to you too on the staffing. But there probably are others. I would like to, as for Mr. Prouty, and I'd like to come back to at some point, what are our strategies in those verticals? And how are we, if we know staffing, training, because we're kind of talking about different challenges to what we all want to accomplish, what are we doing in those to get there?
And I will say before Ms. Hewlett goes, we meet bi-weekly with Office of Human Resources and Development, and we talk extensively about these things. We not only monitor where we are in staffing, currently what we're projecting, but we're brainstorming together what we need to do to recruit special educators, what we need to do to keep them once we have them. So that is work that is taking place across offices.
I know it is, so thank you. I appreciate that. Yes.
In regard to staffing for our English language development program, in 2022, we contracted the Center for Applied Linguistics to evaluate our program. And in that evaluation, at a national level, the staffing ratios for English language development instruction was about 1 to 12. Our current staffing ratio is about 1 to 40. And that's where we are. And that's just for English language development instruction for the teachers. So yes, we need to increase our English language development workforce, have funding to grow those numbers. Dr. Taylor is aware. We have met several times. It is his intention. He has stated that his intention is to address that need for more language development teachers. Both programs have a huge need because our populations are growing, and so that's where we are. And we can't hire our way out of English language development, which is why the professional learning for our classroom teachers is also critical. Because our students actually spend more time in the classroom environment than with an English language development teacher. 3 times a week at the elementary level, 40 minutes, and then the rest of their day is immersed in the classroom, or every day for 45 minutes in your ELD course. But language is everywhere, so we can't just only focus on the staffing, and staffing is a need.
I appreciate that. It's that intensive time. If you have a 1 to 12, for that time that they are with that teacher, you can do more, you can get more done, and it's more as opposed. But you obviously have to address the larger issues in the building.
Correct.
Okay, I'm going to pause now. That was my 15. I'll go back to Councilor Bravo now.
Thank you. So, salary compensation, critical. We're doing our best to address that. Recruitment and retention, providing those support services that once we do have these incredible professionals, helping them stay, and they're often the best recruiters. If they're having a good experience, then they will tell people in their networks what a great experience they're having. And then, of course, as best we can, creating more positions. Like, all those things have to happen at the same time and simultaneously. And that's what we're talking about, and it's a complicated puzzle that isn't going to get any easier. I mean, we had a tough budget. Every year is a tough budget. I mean, when has it not been a tough budget? And I had a meeting yesterday with one of our largest primary care providers, and not just Montgomery County, but in the entire D.C. region. And based on what's being proposed in the GOP budget, they're not sure how they're going to be able to continue to move forward. And they have, just in Montgomery County alone, over 8,000 patients. By the way, many of them are the families that we're talking about right now. And that's where they're getting their health care. So, you know, there's just the layers to this are overwhelming sometimes, and complicated. But we're going to obviously continue to do the best that we can. So I did want to come back to this communication component. It's an overwhelming process and system for people who are able to speak English. And I shared this story last year. I'll bring it up again because I think it's the appropriate context. I attended my child's back-to-school night earlier this year, which I was blown away by, incredibly well organized. It was awesome. But I noticed there was a parent who, and I've shared this publicly before, but my child has an IEP. And this parent was in the class, didn't speak a lick of English, but she was there just to support her child because she had been invited as a parent and she was going to go, even though she didn't know what exactly was going on. And her child was translating for her in this classroom, which is not unusual. It happens all the time. So I, being bilingual, went over, and she was in like 4 of my kids' classes, and so I had the opportunity. We got to know each other. I made her laugh. It was great. It was great. But I, had the opportunity to kind of translate for her in real time and explain what was going on. It was a missed opportunity because, oftentimes, as we know, and I'm preaching to the choir, our parents, not just the children, our parents don't feel fully engaged or part of this complicated process. And so the Black and Brown Coalition made a series of recommendations on how better to communicate with parents and how we can meet more of them where they are so that they are more likely to take an assessment. They are more likely to know what services are available to their children and then advocate for them to be able to take them. So with that as context, how are we doing on the communication front? And what are we doing differently or more or expanded since those recommendations were made last year?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I'll start, and then I'll ask Ms. Nikki Hazel to come up to speak specifically about some of the work that we're doing right now. So much work was done in trying to, for us, communicate academic results to families in a way that was meaningful in any way, because for those who are in education, we can see and understand and explain why different assessments assess different things and why they might not be the same and what does it all mean. And yet, even as a consumer of sort of state reports and things like that, they are complicated. They are not easy to follow. So some of the work that we've done, and this information was in the back-to-school nights, was to try and simplify, just use plain language to explain progress for families, to give families some tools of questions that they can ask that might prompt a discussion that can help address a particular barrier. And so systemically, that was introduced to all schools, I think, last year, and then repeated at this year's back-to-school time. But to speak specifically to the communication piece, which is work, we heard that very clearly. We're not meeting our families where they are. They're confused, and often our partners are where they're going to get information. And so it's really critical that we're working together to make sure that we're all understanding the same thing and that we're sharing what the need is and responsive to that. So with the new literacy policy, we have been doing some field work with it, and I'll ask Ms. Hazel.
Yes, hi, good morning. So we have been working with the Black and Brown Coalition for over a year around this idea of increasing and improving our communication with our families. It was a large ask that we had kind of agreed to narrow down to really focus on elementary and focus on literacy first. And so we have been working with Black and Brown Coalition and a set of schools to really hear from parents in those schools about what works best for them. And so we have been working with 5 elementary schools, and parents have expressed they prefer either weekly or biweekly communication from their child's teacher or intervention specialist if they have one, that they prefer emails, text messages, and then phone calls, kind of in that order, in terms of the types of communication. And they have also been giving us feedback around our district letters to families, and basically really explaining to us what is confusing about the letter and how we can make it more parent-friendly. At the same time, as Dr. Pugh mentioned, Maryland State Department of Education came out with their literacy policy, which one of the components of the policy is increased communication. And so we have been merging the work of the Black and Brown Coalition and this policy, which we will be rolling out very soon, that essentially says if children are not meeting the proficiency standards, it is an expectation that families are notified immediately, and it is an expectation that students are placed into some type of reading intervention plan. So it's not an IEP, we're not, it's not at that level, but it is a plan that every student must have that is documented, and schools are required then to share what they are doing for the student outside of that first instruction to meet the needs of the students. What's the timeline? It needs to be documented, and they need to be communicating with parents on a regular basis. So we're combining the efforts. We're meeting with Black and Brown Coalition biweekly to share our progress and really work to make sure that we have a strong communication plan for our families starting at elementary level, and then we will move up as we move in the next few years. We intend in the springtime to send out a communication to our kindergarten cohort of families, because that group of students would be most impacted by the literacy policy. As they get to grade 3, things really begin to tighten, and we want to make sure that our families are aware of some of the changes that are coming forward with literacy and making sure that they are on track.
Thank you.
Really important set of questions around communication, because none of this works if parents don't know what's going on and they can't help. And to Councilmember Albanez's point, I went to a couple of back-to-school nights too, and just being able to expand, again, I know everything costs money, but like the ability, when we have a council meeting, we have simultaneous translation. Those little kits, I know some places do, some schools do, but I would venture most don't, just because they don't have the access to the technology. That could be a very, probably not super expensive way, at least on like major all-school meetings like that, to have translation in the languages that are very prevalent at the schools that you're at. Councilmember Mink. And we're going to end before 12:30. All right, we're going to end at 12:15. So, Councilmember Mink.
Good. Okay, so circling around to the special ed population, and we've talked about a lot of the needs that we have there, and appreciate the lifting up of some of the recruitment and retention tools that we have up for consideration within the budget, including including the reevaluation of the paraeducators, and kind of lifting all boats in that way. There's another issue that I have heard about from a couple principals actually last year, which is that if there are students who are identified or recommended to go into a special program like an autism learning center or something like that, if the families decline and then those students end up in their home school, then those are some of the students who we see who are needing a tremendous amount of intervention from staff at that point. Is that something that you all are seeing on the, I saw a couple of those students myself running through the halls and the cafeteria and so on. But how much of a problem is that? And also, what can we do about that?
So I want to reframe it a little bit, because it's not declining.
Sure.
What it is the parents asserting their rights under the law. So what IDEA permits is that if a parent disagrees with a placement decision or other aspects of the IEP, but it generally happens when there is a disagreement on a placement decision, they have a right to file due process. Part of that process is that once a parent files, the student is entitled, in most circumstances, to stay put in the current setting, the last agreed upon educational setting. So we do have parents that disagree, and we have a very knowledgeable community, and I think that is a tremendous asset for our parent community. They do understand what their rights are, and they do actively participate to advocate for their children. But it can pose some challenges where a school team has worked to include the student as much as possible, and they have just exhausted the resources, exhausted the ability to support the student in the environment in which the parent would like for the student to learn. And so when we have those disagreements, we follow, we work with our Office of General Counsel specifically on those cases, but then we also try to provide the supports in the setting that may be beneficial to the student and to the staff there. So if we have to allocate additional staffing resources, if we need to have part of my central office team to go out and observe and make recommendations. But it's a challenging situation because the team has already said that this is a student that needs more than what we can provide. In our services that are regional, they're regional for a reason because we can pool resources there, and we can put a behavior specialist, we can put a social worker in a school where all students don't need that level of support. So when there is disagreement, it's a hard situation. But we continue to work to try to come to a consensus with families. So the fact that a parent may file because they disagree doesn't mean that we stop trying to work with them. And so oftentimes we are able to reach a consensus and identify a path forward that it works both for the school and both for the student. But we do have cases where we're essentially in a holding pattern because the student has a right to be where they are until the issue is resolved.
Right, and I certainly, as you said, I don't take issue with the right. I think that's important, and I don't know how many families or students this applies to, but even, one student who has, an incorrect classification, I'm not saying whether that's MCPS or the family or whatever, but, we could all agree that one student who has an incorrect classification, that can be, for that one student, obviously, a huge problem for them, and also highly impactful on the environment that they're in as well. And so figuring out how we can, help to lower those numbers of students who might not be in the right place, is worth some consideration. And one of the things that I heard about as well as related to this is with the autism learning centers that there may be some, of course there could be issues of stigma, cultural issues that may happen, education around what exactly, I'm sure you could speak in detail to a lot of the different factors. One of the ones that I had not realized was that students who are in those learning centers, because of the curriculum that's there, and maybe other factors as well, transitioning from there back into a homeschool is difficult. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the impression that I've gotten. And so, if there's families who feel that, okay, if they agree that this is the best setting for their kid for now, they're also, signing up for, at that moment, for their kid to be in a different place when they finish high school. And so there's, that creates understandable hesitance to enter that program. Can you speak to that?
So I think it's two different things that are not necessarily related. So we do have situations where students, I think what you're speaking more to is the students who are working towards a diploma versus a certificate.
Exactly.
In the first instance, we do have students who are on a diploma who may need to be in a different school setting to receive the services that they need. They're working in the same instructional curriculum. That does not change. With our students what's been really interesting over the last couple of years is that the Maryland State Department of Education has changed the criteria for students who are not working towards a diploma to reduce the number of students that fit that category. And so federal law is less than 1% of your student population should be on the certificate track. So what we have found over the last couple of years is that and this is an annual determination that we have to make when IEPs are reviewed, students who would have otherwise been eligible to work towards a certificate, and it is appropriate because they have significant cognitive disabilities, are no longer being found eligible. That impacts, just imagine if you've gone from K to 5th grade and you were not working towards a diploma, and now in the 6th grade, because of this new criteria, you now have to learn curriculum-based, diploma-bound content. So that's one of the challenges that we're facing. Parents do have to consent to removing their child from the diploma track. And so some parents opt not to do that, or some parents may agree and they can always rescind their agreement at a later date. So I think what you're speaking to is where we do have situations where where a student would be eligible and they're moved to a setting that they're not working towards a diploma, and the curriculum is not different. The instruction and the level of rigor is different. So moving between the two does pose a challenge, where if a parent says in 2 years, well, now I don't consent and I want my student to work towards a diploma, it is challenging to bring them back into content area diploma-bound instruction. It is not impossible. We have specialists at central office that do that work. They work with school teams so that if there is a situation where we need to move in one direction or the other, they're working with the school team, general and special educators, to identify how to move that student along. But it also depends on where that student is in their educational career, because it looks very different for elementary versus a high school student who's working towards credits towards graduation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and what I've heard, from community members is, that hesitant, because it's so difficult to transition back, is that hesitance to have their kid go and enter that program in the first place. Maybe it's the best place, but am I effectively signing my kid up then for a certificate program? Because really transitioning them back in a few years when they may have their feet under them in various other ways, or be resourced in the way that they need, might make that the diploma track possible theoretically, but to your point, in terms of curriculum, that would be an extremely difficult transition to make. And I guess that leads us to, the importance of, for kids who have a lot of needs, who are staying in their home schools, ensuring that we have the staffing to be able to accommodate them, that we have the one-on-one aides, that we have the para-educators. Can you speak to, for our TPTs, like the turnover rate of TPTs versus, our positions that have benefits, our paras and our one-on-one aides and our,
So I don't have the data. I can certainly get that for you all, with the turnover rate for temporary part-time versus our benefited paras. Anecdotally, I can say that it is a position that there is turnover because you have people who do not come into the job with the level of training that we would desire for the students that they're working with. Now, some students may require that level of service because they have medical needs, and so it may be much easier to onboard them using a school nurse to teach them how to change a feeding tube or how to track a diabetic student's blood sugar or something like that. But when you talk about the behavioral needs of students who, because of their disability, they need that additional support of someone that is able to de-escalate them and identify what their needs are, identify what their triggers are, remove them from situations that may pose challenges. That is a skill set that takes time to develop. And so we have had situations where a principal hires one day and within a week or two or a month, that person leaves because they weren't equipped or were not aware of what the job looked like. And so, you know, we've talked a lot with HR and with Ms. Murick. How do we implement professional learning on an ongoing basis where we're giving time to onboard so that we're not just bringing someone in and not giving them the preparation to work with a particular student that has some very specific and defined needs.
So when we have students who are in this position of, you know, clearly needing more staffing and more attention than they're getting, and we're seeing, I mean, random staff positions from the main office stepping in to be monitoring this kid, like one-on-one basically, for portions of the day. And sometimes those might be kids who are in that like 9-month, you know, evaluation period, and you know, there's various reasons. Is it primarily a lack of available staffing to be able to have, you know, paraeducators that we can then in that moment, you know, we hear there's an emergency, let's assign somebody there? Is that primarily, you know, we're looking at our shortage of staffing that allows us to not be as agile and adept at quickly getting somebody there?
The paraeducator position is the position that we have the most vacancies. So absolutely, that's a primary issue. But I think the other piece to that is you do need to have a whole school approach when you have a student that has needs. The woman that or gentleman that works in the cafeteria needs to know, I need to speak in a soft tone to this particular student. The security guard needs to know what students' needs are. When you take that whole school approach, then everybody is working for the good of the student. And I think sometimes it is challenging for schools to be able to take that approach with 700 kids and 2 that are, you know, that have some significant needs. But I don't want to say that it is just a problem with being able to fill para vacancies. It's a systemic need to shift mindsets, as Ms. Hewlett said earlier, so that everyone is owning the work of working with students who receive special education services.
And thank you for framing it that way, because I think it's important that we understand that you're not asking for that to be the solution alone either. Like, this is really a both-and situation. We don't have enough of folks who are there and available to be specializing and providing that level of attention, and the full staff needs and students deserve for everybody to be trained and to understand how to, you know, intervene appropriately within their spheres. And, you know, I got a letter, or I saw a letter that was sent from the staff at a school, an elementary school in my district, to central office. You know, and they really sound desperate, and it's in reference to 2 students who they clearly love and care about, of course. However, those 2 students are, you know, unmanageable in ways that are disrupting a lot and have caused, you know, staff to have to go home for medical reasons due to injuries. And I want to say that I'm so shocked that I've never heard of this happening before, but this has been happening. I have a friend who was a special ed teacher in MCPS who left the system after she was injured multiple times by a student who she loved also, but she was unable to provide adequate care for the student. And I just wanted, and I'm going to turn to Sally in just a moment, that, you know, I hear all of you working to address this. And so I just think that it's so important that we are really leaning into this and making sure that our colleagues really understand, and also the taxpayers of the county understand, like, this is an urgent, dire situation. And, you know, the superintendent budgeting to make all those TPTs benefited positions, the superintendent budgeting for the paraeducator reclassification, all the talk that we're doing today about the training, the professional development that is so badly needed. Again, as has been said, these are not nice to haves. Like, we have places in our school system all over that are crumbling, and students who are not getting what they need and staff who are not getting what they need. And we're being told these are the fundamental pieces that we need to at least fill some of those gaping holes. But those cost money, and without them, it's going to get worse. And so we have some tough conversations ahead, but I think it's incumbent on all of us also to be having these conversations with the public so that they understand where their taxpayer dollars are going. And, you know, if we can't fund things, like what that's going to look like, and I'm not even saying necessarily where that goes or not, we're going to have these conversations with every department, you know, in front of us. But just making sure that we're very transparent about, look, here's the needs, here's the cost of some of the solutions, what are we going to do this year, what are we going to do next year, what do we need to pass at the state level so that we can have more revenue. Obviously, we got federal problems, but I thank you all for bringing to us with such clarity what the problems are and what the potential solutions are and the needs. And I'm going to turn to Sally.
Yeah. And Ms. Sally, if you go, and I'm going to give Councilmember Albanaz the last word, but you go ahead.
I'm going to go.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, we all agree it's money. We all know, and we can't make it fall out of the sky. I wish we could. Maybe you're printing it in the basement. We don't know. We haven't checked. But we have to be creative and think about other ways that we can work through these issues. And that includes our human resources. What are their processes for hiring and for onboarding? These are things we've brought up ways, suggestions. We wanted a paraeducator pool where they are trained on these higher need students before they go into a school. And they're kind of like an assigned substitute, but they're a permanent employee. And they go in and they stay there until maybe a vacancy can be filled. And then they go to the next student, kind of like a rover. If you ever worked retail or something, you're a rover for all departments. But they would get training before they even were assigned. Nothing's happened. We tried to have permanent substitutes, paraeducators, permanent, that was their job, kind of like the rover. Again, assigned to specific clusters that had higher need programs. And they would know, they'd have a job every day. They might have one school, might be their home school, but if there was a vacancy, somebody out sick, injured, I've heard, there's a lot of injuries. I know you've heard all staff, not just teachers and paras. People are getting hurt. And so they could go, and they would be, they'd be there. They'd know some basics about what might be happening in that school with that child. I'll harken back to the days where we did have money. I'm so old, I remember that when MCPS had this great program, Success for Every Student, and there was an assigned teacher substitute at every school. They showed up at that school every day, and if somebody was out, a teacher or a para, they subbed for that person. They got to know the whole kids. Everybody knew them. There was another teacher in the building. You just never knew what classroom he or she was going to show up in. Instruction continued. The students were served. And if nobody was out, then the teachers could have a planning time. If they didn't have joint common planning time, then they would sub for a class so that teacher could go, or the teacher could go and observe another class. I mean, there are great ideas out there, but again, they take money.
I appreciate that. Councilmember Albanaz.
Sorry, I was sitting on my hands the whole time because I was so excited. Well, it's the wrong word. I appreciated that Councilmember Rink brought up this issue. So sadly, it's not unique, and it is a growing problem. And this isn't just a staffing or personnel issue. This is a system and policy issue because the school system has its hands tied. They're doing their best to address the needs of these students to meet them where they are, but there are some examples, egregious examples of students that are violent, that are not only attacking staff and personnel, but other students. And to expect, even with one-on-one coverage in a school of more than 1,000 people, for that scenario to be effective or go well every day, all the time, is setting everybody up for failure. And I don't know what the solution is. I appreciate and respect it is a complicated issue, and the school system is absolutely doing the best that it can given the circumstances, but I do think that from a policy perspective, this is something we should be looking at systemically, because the parents are desperate. Oftentimes, they're hiring advocates to represent them and who are very familiar with the system. But it sometimes is not in the best interest of the system as a whole or the child himself or herself. And we just have to acknowledge that. And so I know there's a lot here. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know what the answer is, but what currently is happening is not working. And I credit you all for doing the best you can. But, you know, we need to look at this legislatively, both at the local, but mostly the state level, because we have to be able to provide some reprieve for everyone. So, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, we could be here all day talking about this. This is a very good conversation. Obviously, I'm thinking of one student. I'm thinking of one situation at a high school, a large high school, where one or two or more staff are following students that they know are going to have behavioral issues around the school, like waiting for something to happen. Like, that's just untenable, and it's not the school's fault, but that's just what they've defaulted to just try to manage like a fight, you know, like from just breaking out imminently and impacting students and teachers. And, you know, we need alternative education we didn't talk about today. But, you know, obviously that's an issue where both quality and space, places to put kids that do need extra help. Again, we want to be inclusive as possible, but there are kids, we all know this, there's kids that need that kind of space. So that's obviously a part of it, but I really, really just want to emphasize and end on a good note. You all are doing quite a bit. I think you're very honest and direct about the challenges and the opportunities that we face, and I think we've talked about some of the both and things that are already happening. So thank you. We'll come back to these issues. Thank you for all your work, and with that, we are adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.
The Amazing Race, and some of the families in the neighborhood that I used to babysit for, they were like, oh my gosh, we're cheering for you, we're rooting you on.
Kishori graduated from Quince Orchard High School in 2016 before heading to American University in Washington, D.C. to pursue her higher education. She says that the skills she learned along the way might have helped her compete on the show.
You know, it's interesting. So on The Amazing Race, you really don't know what types of challenges you're going to get. The challenges can vary from, you know, dancing, singing, swimming, a puzzle, mental challenge. And so, like, as much as you try to prepare, you just really don't know. But I do think there were a couple of things that did help me. So I grew up doing theater. I grew up competitively swimming. I was on the Lakeland's Lionfish swim team. I did a cappella at QO.